And of course, Marvin also had many brilliant technical accomplishments. But in terms of the big idea, I think that's one that he deserves credit for.
And then finally, of the trio, Chomsky.
Certainly Chomsky was one of the, had an enormous influence on me. And many people that I speak to, journalists or people that I meet when giving talks and so on, assume that either I was a student of Chomsky's or that I worked with Chomsky, which I didn't do. Chomsky was in a different department, and being a linguist, his methods tended to be different from mine. I was more of an experimentalist. But it was when I was a student, I think I was like a freshman, that I read an article in the New York Times magazine in, I think, 1972, which first, I think, exposed the world to the Chomskyan revolution in linguistics. And I remember being utterly fascinated by this. Again, these were big ideas. And I tend to think, inasmuch as you can identify early influences, that one of the reasons I went into cognitive science was because of reading about Chomsky in the New York Times Sunday magazine. Among the ideas that inspired me were the idea that, I guess, allied to Minsky's, that you can think of mental life as symbol manipulation or computation. In Chomsky's case, the idea that the mind is a complex system composed of a number of faculties, language being one of them. The idea that much of the organization of the mind was innate, an idea that was completely revolutionary and incendiary in the late 50s when Skinnerian psychology ruled both in psychology and in large part in linguistics. And Noam overturned that by saying that children are, in some sense, pre-programmed to acquire language. My own attempted contribution to this idea was to flesh out exactly what the child was born with in terms of a learning algorithm that allowed him to acquire language. And also, I think what excited me about the whole Chomskyan oeuvre was also the way it tied contemporary work on what makes people tick, to ancient questions about human nature. And that was another thing, that Chomsky revived ideas that really had been kind of dormant since the Enlightenment of what is a human like and how does that tie into our political arrangements, the way we conceptualize humans in the broadest sense. An idea that, even though I found it tremendously exciting at the time, I didn't really come back to until my most recent book, The Blank Slate, which returned to some of these issues. Chomsky in particular argued that even though a kind of consensus among intellectuals is that the politically enlightened view is that the mind is a blank slate, that was an appealing idea because it would seem to negate the possibility that races or sexes or individuals could be innately different, or that there were constraints on the kind of society that we built owing to flaws in human nature. Chomsky turned that on its head and said, well, in fact, a blank slate can also be a reactionary doctrine because it's a totalitarian's dream. If people really are blank slates, then a dictator is apt to think that we damn well better control what gets written on those slates instead of leaving it up to chance. And Chomsky's own libertarianism and anarchism owes in part to his conception, I think, of a rich human nature that can't simply be written at will by political leaders. On the other hand, there are a number of regards in which my own work and my own thinking are quite distinct from Noam's. In terms of actual technical linguistic work, the analyses of language that I feel more comfortable with are not as abstract and far removed from actual surface forms as is typical in Chomsky's own theories. Just to give a concrete example, although I certainly agree that you can't describe language at the level of just the surface order of words, that there are underlying mental representations, such as the semantic ones that we talked about earlier. But often, those of you who are familiar with Chomsky's technical work in linguistics know that they can get extremely abstract and far from anything that a child actually hears in growing up. Just take a very simple example, one that I explored in some of my other work on language. Here's a regularity about language. Among the English irregular verbs, you've got ring, rang, has rung, drink, drank, has drunk, sing, sang, has sung. There are a few others. So it looks like there's a rule that says for a certain subclass of words to go from the base form to the past, change I to a, lower the vowel, and then to go to the participle, lower it further to a. It goes to a, goes to a. Well, here's another form. I run, I ran, I have run. Well, that kind of fits the pattern 66.7% of the time. I mean, the preterite or past tense works, the participle works, ran, run, but the damn stem isn't what it should be. Now, according to a proposal by Noam and by Morris Holly in their magnum opus, The Sound Pattern of English, a solution to this problem is that the underlying form, kind of the deep structure, if you will, of the verb run is to rin, and that it's actually stored in memory as to rin, and that there is, in addition to the rules that convert I to a or I to a, there's a special rule for run that converts the I to a even for the base form of the verb. Now that's just a tip of the iceberg of the incredible intellectual beauty of the sound pattern of English and of much of Noam's work. But for me as a psychologist, it just doesn't sound plausible, because how's the poor child going to know that the underlying form of run is rin? And what good does it do him, since he's got to start with run and memorize it anyway? So I think there's something of a disconnect between characterizations of language that are done with an eye towards economy, elegance as the main criterion, and those that are meant as the most accurate possible description of the mind of a child. So that's a kind of example. And elsewhere, my first theory of language acquisition used a theory of language that was not orthodox Chomskyan theory, but the variant